What brought you to the markets?
Look, like Warren Buffett says, you have to know how much is skill and how much is luck. But price movement always attracted me, so I said, okay, let us have a look. So I must have been in class 12 when I did my first transaction. Holding on for a long time was a great thing in good companies.
So what kind of investing did you do in the early years?
Because you were assured almost of people telling you 5 साल में double होगा. You learn to read balance sheets, but you don't really read investment theories. Yes.
So you didn't have this fetish that, oh, I should not do any trading, or you should do only trading, or you should do only investing. You just went with the flow.
Whenever I address people, they ask, what type of an investor are you? So I sell off at a loss. I let my profits run long, but I don't let my losses run long. So you miss the bus at times because you bracket yourself, and sometimes you say, let me go with the flow.
What do you believe you learned from others?
Then I learned that it takes a long time to judge a promoter. And it took me 10-15 years to know that this man is a genius. How do you know which one to keep and which one to sell off? Every day there is a headline saying this problem, that problem. I should never sell equity in pen. This was self-learned. Nobody can teach you that. So if Maruti is going to do well, Maruti supplier would do well. Kapil Dev need not speak good English, he has to bowl well.
Storytelling and reading the story before it's told.
The best companies in my portfolio never come on the media.
If you're really good, your chocolate should not have worms. So now let's talk about your experience in market. Where do we begin? We'll begin from how you got interested in the markets. What brought you to the markets?
Look, like Warren Buffett says, you have to know how much is skill and how much is luck. Complete luck that my father decided to shift to Ghatkopar when I was 2 years old, or maybe less. And all my upbringing has been with Gujaratis. And Gujaratis by nature are interested in business or in equity markets. They don't even consider going into service as an option. So when you have these classmates, these building mates, neighbors, etc., who are all into equity markets, the chances are you also like equity markets. That was a time when, we would not even buy Economic Times, and it was considered to be an expensive paper and a business paper. So only offices bought it. So whenever somebody went to the office, you picked it up and you saw. But otherwise, Business India, Business World had not yet made their debut, or they were just about, making their debut. So it was largely restricted to, say, the last page of your regular dailies, where you saw about business and things like that. But price movement always attracted me, so I said, okay, let us have a look. So I must have been in class 12 when I did my first transaction. So that reminds me, people have to know that even as a minor you could open an account, you can open a savings bank account, you could sign, and you could buy shares and sell in your name, and you held the shares physically. There was no question of a demat. So all that was happening. So that was 1979. But my father had started investing even in 1957. He had some surplus, so he had invested. Maybe he had lost some money, but he had invested in companies like Hindalco, which we still hold. And he had some Tata Steel, Tata Motors. And in 1977, I don't think people give enough credit, but the man who really brought equity market to the middle class was a socialist named George Fernandez. He forced the MNCs to either do an Indian FERA dilution or leave the country. Now Coca-Cola decided to leave the country, IBM chose to leave the country, but Colgate, Hindustan Lever, Hindustan Unilever, which is now Hindustan Unilever, All of them decided to stay on in India and did an IPO. Siemens, Cummins, which used to be called Kirloskar Cummins, all those companies decided that they will stay back in India and do an IPO. So your Nestle, Ponds, all of them decided to stay back and did an IPO, and that was a time when shares were not so difficult to get. I don't know how many people had that much of money, but my father put only 1,000 rupees or 1,250 in, say, Colgate, and today I think my dividend is in 6 figures. So holding on for a long time was a great thing in good companies, and that's how the journey started.
And what was the kind of investments you made in stocks? In each stock, like as a small investor, right? There are a lot of people today who do these trades on a Zerodha or Upstock or whatever, Grow or whatever sites are there. They are also buying one stock in this, 5 stocks in that. So there's a lot of micro investing that is happening. Can you tell me what was the kind of investing you did? Because then there was something called as the lot. So you cannot buy less than 100 or 50, right?
Correct.
Whereas you would not have had the money as a student or as a teenager to put in that kind of money. So what kind of investing did you do in the early years?
So typically it would be the minimum possible. So if you had a in Suzuki or TVS Suzuki, whatever, I don't remember what it was
called
then.
in Suzuki then.
In Suzuki. So the share would be 30 rupees and the minimum I had to buy was 50 shares. So 1500 rupees is the maximum. 1500 was big amount of money. So 1500 went to 1600, you sold off and said, wow, I made 100 rupees. So that is how small trades started, and yeah, my ticket size would be only 1000 to 1500. For my father, I could have bought say worth 4000, 5000 rupees. He allowed me to do that, and that is how the whole process started.
So you are also investing for him, and that gave you experience.
Right.
Right. And did you try a hand at buying odd lots? Because that was something which you can you tell something about your experience with odd lots?
I bought odd lots in shares like MRF. So my first purchase of MRF must have been somewhere in the 80s. I don't think I paid more than 600, 700 rupees for the share. The maximum I paid was 800 rupees for the MRF share, which again used to have, I think, lot of 5 or 10, but it used to be an expensive share. So I would buy 3 shares, 2 shares. I slowly accumulated some 20, 30 MRF by buying odd lots. So odd lot buying, especially in Bangalore and Chennai, was possible. Bombay did not, whereas Chennai and Bangalore had a special odd lot session where only odd lots would be traded. So I would get a Chennai broker to buy odd lots for me, and that also was a way to acquire shares.
So how did you build your portfolio? You just bought whatever you liked, or you went about based on some particular investment approach, or what was it like?
Actually, when I look back, I don't know whether there was too much of an approach, because the IPOs for which we applied were the expensive shares, the Colgate's, Nestle. They were not cheap at any stage. Okay, people think, oh, it was only 90 rupees, but even then the PE must have been very high. But luckily for us, we saw it in absolute terms. Oh, then Century used to be an expensive share.
Correct.
And I bought shares largely because the companies would pay dividend. Believe it or not, I think I bought HDFC below par. It was a 100 rupee share which I bought for some 97 rupees because I think it used to pay 10% dividend. So you were getting a 10% dividend yield. I think Tata Power was giving 7-8% dividend yield. But remember, those time fixed deposits were giving 13-14%. Maybe inflation was high, but 7-8% of dividend yield was very attractive because you were assured almost of people telling you 5 साल में double होगा. So 14% return because of that rule of 72 plus 7% meant you were getting 20-21% return, which I considered was fantastic. And I knew I would never withdraw because all the dividend would again get reinvested, and that's how the portfolio building started. But largely dividend yield, company paying good dividend, regularly paying dividend, and companies giving bonus. Some such attraction was there, and therefore I was buying. I did not know words like value investing, dividend based investing, reinvesting of dividend. Nothing I knew, absolutely no theory I had read. And then I was doing CA, but believe it or not, even in CA there is no investment theory which you do. You do accounting, all that. You learn to read balance sheets, but you don't really read investment theories. Nobody tells you about Peter Lynch and Buffett, and nothing of that I had heard by the time I was 22, 23, qualified as a chartered accountant, but I had no clue about these names, these words. None of the investment reading, nothing I had started.
By the time you finished your CA, what was the approximate size of your portfolio? How many stocks did you own? Any memories on that?
Not really. Must have been a few lakhs, maybe not even 10 lakhs or 12 lakhs, maybe. Maybe my father had, obviously, even that would have been my father's portfolio. I don't think my portfolio was more than a lakh of rupees. You have to remember, Shyam, you're talking of a time when the chartered accountant's princely salary was 2,500
Correct.
rupees.
That's why I'm trying to understand.
So I
What
don't
was the
remember
starting
the,
number?
I don't remember the numbers, but yeah, it would be maybe a few thousand, maybe just about touching a lakh, because 4-5 years of compounding would have happened. But luckily I never had to touch my equity for anything. That is the
So
reason.
your equity, you are just either investing and holding, or you are doing a trade here and there and putting it back into something else.
Yes.
So you didn't have this fetish that, oh, I should not do any trading, or you should do only trading, or you should do only investing. You just went with the flow. That's it.
Yeah, see, this is what I, whenever I address people, they ask what type of an investor are you? And I say, look, for a fund manager who's managing other people's money, he has to say what style. I do everything. I do day trading. I buy in the morning, and in the end of the day, if it is up by 10-15 bucks, which is about 2-3%, I just sell, hoping that next day I'll be able to buy it back. So, which is really a momentum kind of a trade. I do delivery based trading, which means I buy it, and after a month, if I find it has given 10-12%, I think it's huge. So I sell off. Otherwise, I do deep value investing. I can just hold for a few decades. My oldest share is older than me. It came into my portfolio from my father, but it is older by 6-7 years. It is older than me, right? So I have everything, and I do everything. So there is nothing like, and I bought a share and somebody says it's a bad share. I immediately did research and I sold off. So I sell off at a loss. I let my profits run long, but I don't let my losses run long. So these are some of the things. But no, you cannot classify me and put me in one. You can't bracket my style. I do everything.
From your experience, what is your observation of people who actually bracket themselves? Because you say you don't. Why didn't you feel the urge to bracket yourself? Why didn't you want to be?
I didn't.
Why not?
I didn't even know how to bracket myself.
No, but later.
No, later on also I somehow don't know what, when I'm getting into a transaction, let's say I bought a Colgate. For me, a good company meant an MNC. Largely we were told MNCs have good books, clean books, they share their profits, and we saw it also because huge dividend payouts. So I said, wow, so much of dividend. I paid 1,200 rupees for this share, they're paying 3,000 rupees as dividend. And so it was fun holding them. So the standards were the MNCs. And then you compare them to Indian companies, and you say, oh, this is also a good share, they are also paying. So I didn't even know that whether I was a growth style. I didn't even know there were styles and I had to bracket myself. I didn't know any of these things. I just bought HDFC because HDFC was paying good dividend. I bought Apollo Hospital sometime later at 9 rupees 50 paise or 9 rupees, again dividend yield. Coromandel dividend.
Dividend they are giving at 9 rupees.
So we were getting some 20% dividend yields when fixed deposits were paying 12-13%. There was no question of So that is the time I said, oh, I am buying it for dividend. So today, if you say, at that time I was a value investor. And very funnily, this caught me into a trap also, because at 145 or something, when my 9 rupee investment in Apollo had become 145, I thought now there is no dividend yield. So I sold off, because I thought I had captured the full value. I didn't realize that it could go up further, and then I re-entered at 700 or 750, exited at 900, bought it again at 900, exited at 1300. At every stage I felt it was fully valued, and now it is at 4,000. So you miss the bus at times because you bracket yourself, and sometimes you say, let me go with the flow, let me see how it is. At some stage, suddenly if the company is just is an infrastructure provider and infrastructure companies start buying it, maybe it will go up even more for 4,000. So you don't know. So I didn't want to get myself trapped into anything. And an endowment effect, today I can't sell a Nestle or a Colgate because I say, oh, it's a great share, it has done well in the past. Forcing myself to sell today becomes difficult. But yeah, you get trapped, and I didn't want to get trapped because I was not handling other people's money. If I had handled other people's money, they would have asked me, are you value, are you growth, are you only looking for dividend? Because I can't say I'm a dividend based investor when I hold Colgate. It is giving me what, 1% return on market price. It is unfair. So today in such a market, I don't think there is any dividend yield share. The best of shares give you 1 or 2% return. So you can't be a value investor and be invested in this market. Then you should get out of the market completely and wait. I mean, then you do a Buffett-like behavior, which I am not willing to do. So am I value, am I growth, am I momentum? I'm a bit of everything, and I don't see the need to bracket myself.
You're saying that freedom
Yeah.
is very important to you. That
Yeah.
you do what you like, and you are not answerable to anyone because you're your own in person. What do you believe you learned from others? Because this learning from others is now something which is believed to be most important. There are a lot of things you learn on your own. There are a few things you learn from others as well. Of late, people who are coming into the market are placing a lot of emphasis to what they can learn from others because they can learn faster. Because what you learn on your own takes longer.
Correct.
So there is a shorter cycle time learning,
True.
which they believe is actually better learning. It's easier learning, no doubt, but people believe that it is better learning. Now, from your experience, can you segregate this what you learned on your own and what you learned from others, and how what you learned on your own improved by absorption from others?
See, what happened was sometime in the 1980s, I had decided that I will not work with anybody, so I started my own practice, and that was the time when people were asking me for portfolio advice. There was nothing called portfolio management, so I decided to become a sub-broker, which was step one to becoming a broker. So I had become a sub-broker, and that was a time when we used to do research for big foreign banks. So foreign banks would tell me, Subra, your report is as good as what my head office makes, except that it is not in good quality paper, etc. So there I saw what institutions were looking at companies. For example, when an institutional investor looked at a company, he would say 15 quarters of rising EPS, right? So which ruled out your cyclicals and commodities and all were out. So he said, oh, this is the way they look at it. I didn't know that they will look at it that way. So that happened, which I learned from institutional investors. Then I learned that it takes a long time to judge a promoter. So it was in 1980 that I bought HDFC Limited, and it took me 10-15 years to know that this man is a genius. So Deepak Parekh shares, I didn't see any reason to sell, and that time I also got HDFC Bank. And the benefit of HDFC Bank was I knew that this is coming from a good parentage, I need not sell. But HDFC Limited, having bought in 1980, I would sell a little, because how do you know, how do you judge? That was a time when Dhirubhai Ambani was also a businessman and Kapil Mehra was also a businessman. How do you know that you should sell Orkay but keep Reliance? Anybody who tells you that you should hold shares for the long run completely forget that your portfolio is not just that one share, right? It is not just that in 1980 I put 10,000 rupees in Wipro, didn't put anywhere else. How did you know that Mr. Premji with his software skills would create such a magnificent company? That was a time when perhaps even Silverline was available and HFCL was available. How do you know which one to keep and which one to sell off? Right, those are the challenges. You knew that there was a phenomenon called Dhirubhai Ambani. 1977 or 78 I invested, but I kept selling. You don't know what would go wrong. Every day there is a headline saying this problem, that problem, VP Singh is a problem, Dhirubhai is having that problem. How do you hold your shares during such
So
time?
what did you learn in this? On your own, what did you learn?
So on my own I learned that yes, you should hold on, you shouldn't panic, because I saw the biggest mistake you could make was selling shares when markets were down. So that I said I will not do. I learned one thing amazing is to say I should never sell equity in panic. This was self-learned. Nobody can teach you that. I ensured that I had other cash flows to meet other requirements. Whether it is day-to-day expenses or medical, there was insurance. My father was employed in a good company. So we never luckily, this is luck, that we never had an emergency where we had to sell our portfolio when the markets were doing badly. So occasionally when the markets were doing well, you'd sell 100 shares, 200 shares, which again we more a switch. So it's not that we sold something and went on a vacation, or we sold something to buy a fridge or a car. That was happening separately, this was happening separately. This was an important thing, that if you made a mistake of buying at a peak, don't compound that mistake by selling at the bottom.
Okay.
Wait for the next peak.
So if you bought high, you would wait.
You wait. Or you have a strong reason to cut your losses and run. But if you know you had bought a good share, like say even in 1992, I must have been a buyer. I must have bought some shares. It is not that I lost money on them because I could wait. That was an important thing. Yes, I must have seen a dip in my portfolio. In fact, 1993, I think I saw a 95% fall in my income. I was a broker and I saw a 95% fall. I'm not talking of a 5% fall, but a 95% fall. We were 2-3 of us and wondering what will happen. Will the markets ever revive? Will we have to do something else?
The phone won't
It was
ring in the
horrible.
office. No orders.
Phone won't ring, and very funnily, the phone bill used to come once in 2 months, and our cycles were very short. So during a bull market, you make calls, and the bill comes, and the market is a bear market, and you wonder, $15,000, what did you do? Bills used to be so high. Today my annual bill is 5,000.
Correct.
That time a 2-month bill would be 15,000. When incomes were less, bills were high, and that was a big part of your expense.
And what was it that you learned from others?
From others, like I used to, like I said, when I used to do research report, I learned the monumental patience some of those people had, and how they would track. Like for example, if somebody came and said construction industry is going to do well, etc., therefore paints will do well, therefore Asian Paints is a good buy, I could read it as Kajaria Ceramics is a good buy. You realize that the other beneficiaries in the industry are there. So if Maruti is going to do well, Maruti supplier would do well. So you understood to look at a industry, not just one player. Don't look only at Maruti, you look at Maruti supplier. If a Maruti supplier is doing well, it is obvious that Maruti is doing well, because he is supplying 100 Vipers or 10,000 Vipers or 1 million Vipers. 1 million Vipers means 500,000 cars are being made. That's why they are buying. So connecting this and realizing what changes could happen because of the industry changing or people's habits changing, or what I learned from Mr. Munjal, Brijmohan Munjal, the senior Mr. Munjal. I had gone for a press conference with him, a press conference which he was doing, and I asked him, and he said, oh, India is going to boom, we're going to make 1 lakh vehicles. Rajiv Gandhi had just given those permissions. So I asked him, is it that only you will make money? And look at that man's heart. He said, no, all of us will make money. So any share that you buy in this field, you'll make money. I said, a man with such a big heart has to be a good businessman. I bought him, I bought Suzuki, at least I bought Bajaj Auto. And I made money in all the 3 shares. So that hard to give and say my whole industry will do well, therefore I will do well. Lot of gold shower is going to fall, but on me more will fall. Those things you hear, when you hear people like him speak, you realize what is happening. In the Indian Hotels press conference, this man is still active, very articulate, IIM graduate. He ripped the management apart for spending money when the hotel was not doing well. Hotel was doing badly and they were spending money, and this man was far more articulate than the CFO. So he ripped them apart for spending. 3 months, 6 months later, when the market turned, Indian Hotels was having money coming out of his nose and ears and everything. So you realize one more thing, a guy has to be good, he need not be articulate. Kapil Dev need not speak good English, he has to bowl well. We get carried away by people with good communication skills, though they may not have good knowledge. We get carried away by them because they can speak good English, they can, they can intimidate you, even though they know less. And there could be an entrepreneur who's bad in English, bad in communication, but could be very good in his work. Making out the difference between substance and faff, that comes only with experience.
I'm going to take you right into the territory between storytelling and reading the story before it's told. Okay, there are 2 schools. Today I find that storytelling seems to carry a premium more than the premium of the stocks on which the stories are told. On the other hand, when nobody is having the guts to tell the story, right? You're ashamed or afraid that, if I talk about this, if something happens to the stock price, another 10%, others will mock me, people will think I'm an idiot. So nobody talks about a story when it's out of favor, when nobody wants to look at it. But when it's trading at a price which factors in all the negatives and none of the positives, that's the thing that you're talking about when,
Yeah.
So this, what you said about a highly intelligent, super educated person going to a business at a time when the chips are down, when the company is investing heavily and questioning, are you idiots to invest?
Yeah.
Because there was no story, right? So there are two schools, and today these two schools, which you just described, and I have described the other school, are divided down the middle. The market is dividing the market down the middle. So there are more people on the storytelling side. There are hardly anyone on the other side. In every cycle, we have seen this situation, right? Can you show some examples in the past cycles when on the one side stories were being told, on the other side no one is willing to talk about some areas, but as time would have it, the ones where the stories were hidden turned out to be better than ones where the stories were tomed. Can you talk about a few?
I mean, I can talk of two guys who are in the side where they had tremendous conviction in their theories. There was Naren and Prashant Jain. Their ability to stick on to their stories when the whole world is willing to say, oh, these people are past their prime and things like that. These guys hold on to their conviction. This is not prior to HDFC Mutual Fund being formed. For us, the storytelling was Deepak Parekh. We would get the balance sheet of HDFC Limited, look at their portfolio. I mean, they, apart from their own HDFC Mutual Fund and all, they have their own beautiful portfolio. For us, that was a great starting point. We said ESG is taken care of. That time we used to call it corporate governance. Corporate governance is taken care of, therefore HDFC is investing. Then Tata Investments. You picked up these balance sheets and said, let us concentrate on these companies. So we picked up companies like, say, Supreme Industries. Supreme Industries is a story even now nobody talks about. And it is a brilliant compounder over a long period of time. Whatever amount you put, 10 times that you must be getting as a dividend. I realized one thing, the best companies in my portfolio never come on the media. You don't need media support for a good company. That company does well. It's a cash producing machine. They do well. They don't come on television to tom saying this is what we are doing, that is what we are doing. And they just create cash. Like HDFC Limited or an HDFC Bank or Supreme Industries, Coromandel International. They're just cash producing machines, and you just look at cash producing machines, and if you see that these are cash producing machines, you form your own biases because you say, oh, this company seems to be producing cash but is not paying out dividend payout ratio is low, he's based in Hyderabad, I don't know whether to trust him, he's a Delhi based contractor, Jaiprakash, JP Industries, North India based contractor. Construction business I never understood while doing articles, and North India based company bribing the government to get contracts. We never know anything, so just stay away from these companies.
So even when the story was told, you didn't believe?
Yeah, I just didn't believe. Not the story I believed was Hero Honda, because I believe an Indian promoter stays honest because he's got a collaborator. The collaborator would keep him honest and he would keep the collaborator honest, right? So this was the combination I thought will work. So Hero Honda had.
Also, see, in Hero Honda there was a story. The story of taking a country up by 2 strokes.
Yeah.
Literally.
Correct.
Right? So that was the story. And the others didn't read the story at all. Forget investors. The competitor also did not read the story.
Yeah.
So when your competitors fail to read the story, the kind of runway you have and how much you get ahead of competition puts you in a place where it takes a very, very long time for catch up.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
So that was also something which really happened.
Right. I mean, when you met people like Mr. Munjal, senior, you felt inspired saying this man is going to do something, which happened because I met him at a press conference. It's not that I went to his office to meet him or anything. Same thing for meeting Mr. Rungta and Mr. Taparia of Supreme. You met and you knew that there was something great happening in those companies. I did that research in 1988 and I'm still holding. Right, so 12 plus 21, 33 years of holding Supreme. It is a value compounder. Right, these companies you hold because the promoter, you believe in his honesty. He never said, I want to build this company, sell and go. He was building it because he was passionate. He was a cycles man. He believed this would happen. He got the right collaboration and stayed on.
Can you give us some more stories which you discovered, not stories which are told on television? Forget the stories which come on business television. These are some of the stories which you have discovered, right? By by going around, by meeting people, by understanding businesses.
But funnily, you need few such stories. You don't need too many such stories.
Correct, but One or two more you can think of.
Yeah, I mean, the MNCs started cheating when they started taking money from the top line and rather from the bottom line. So you realize that the MNCs which you held in a high pedestal were coming down, and the Indian promoters were going up in their quality. Look at Kajaria Ceramics, look at Lupin. Lupin went from 700 to 70 back to 700. Now I think it's got a good balance sheet. Or Sun Pharma, they've got good balance sheet. I'm not saying they've got top management, but they've got reasonably clean, 95%, 97% clean balance sheets. So those things are happening. Indian entrepreneurs are catching up fast. They're growing fast, and they've really ripped apart the foreign MNCs.
What do you think about this bias that for MNCs are gold standard, they don't have any governance issues? People say these things. These stories are told. What do you think about it? Because I'll give you 2 or 3 examples where I found MNCs to be extremely wanting. In my view, a company which is really good in its governance cannot have a Maggie type of an episode. Okay, if you're really good, you'll prevent it. If you're really good, your chocolate should not have worms. You can't have a Cadbury type of episode. No doubt these companies deployed a lot of money and very powerful branding to pull the customer back. That's a different subject. But look at the accidents. The fact that MNCs have these kind of accidents, and then they also had that 1 decade where Hindustan Lever chasing profitability actually diluted their products. At one point they didn't call the premium soap as a premium soap because it did not have the TFM. So they called it herbal skincare, right? So like this, there are a number of cases where in history the MNCs are actually diluted what should have been the standard.
True.
So in that sense, I don't really see a merit in giving them absolute immunity or absolute trust, in saying that they are completely above board and you can blindly trust them, right?
No way.
So
Those
just like
days are
you
gone.
said that the Indian companies went down, they learned their lessons and then they come back. There are a number of groups like this who have done this. The MNCs are also on the same pedestal.
Correct.
So where does this thing come that, okay, I can overpay for this because it is an MNC and therefore I am getting all this governance premium? What is this? We call it like the Chidambara Rahasya, the esoteric.
Right.
What is this that market sees which we are failing to see, or what is it the market sees beyond what is the truth?
No, I think there is a demand and supply. For example, everybody will tell you that Asian Paints is a great buy. Okay, Asian Paints not an MNC, but or Colgate is a great buy. You go to buy Colgate, the existing shareholders of Colgate are not willing to sell. So I think the demand is greater than supply, so the PE keeps going up. You take HUL. Because it is in the index, every index fund has to buy, every ETF buys. So I think the PEs keep increasing. The EPS is of course good, and the market loves the fact that the cash flow is predictable. Now, if you take a manufacturing company, the cash flow should be predictable. The other advantage which many of these MNCs have is they don't spend any cash outflow. Now, when you see a Google or an Amazon, you realize that they need not spend on any factories and all that. Same thing is true with Indian MNCs. They don't spend money on factory. If they want some supply in Jammu, they will call a Jammu entrepreneur, say set up a factory, send it to us at this price. So their assets are not going up. Their cost of capital is not going up. And they are able to get the material as much as they want. They may pay a little advance, but they may pay him on time. It's not, they're working with a negative working capital, but therefore they are able to keep on increasing their profits without additional money being deployed in assets and all that. And then they have gold standards. And the other advantage I see for them is the ability to attract talent. Today, if a HUL and an Indian company were to walk into any organization, very high chance that that kid will want to join HUL.
Okay.
Their ability to attract and retain talent.
So that is a big point that you think is higher.
Huge point, because today I think we are in the war for talent as much as we are in the war for raw material or water or something. Talent war is a very big war. Ask the HR people and labor.
So if you look at 4-5 cycles, there have been times when MNCs were neglected, like the tech boom. Tech boom clearly saw the decline of MNCs.
Correct.
The infra boom further made it worse, except
Correct.
Siemens and ABB and a few things.
Which
Broadly,
were in infra.
broadly the MNC pack was down.
Correct.
So for a period of nearly 10 years, until 2011, 12 years, the MNCs actually had a bad time. Subsequently, from 2012 onwards, inflation started moving down. That was something which helped MNCs immensely, because once India started fighting inflation, they were the beneficiaries because they didn't have to pass on any of
Correct.
the gains.
Correct.
And then last, in 2019, you had the government actually reducing the corporate taxation below the rates of, let's
Individual.
say, individual or MSME taxation,
Correct,
right?
correct.
Which was ridiculous actually.
Correct.
So that is another aspect that has helped them improve their earnings.
They had cash. in the
Now tell
market,
me, what is it that is the tailwind for the MNC? With so much tailwinds, they had a decade or plus 2 years.
No, I wouldn't say MNC. I would say MNC Pharma or MNC
Consumer.
FMCG. Yeah, some of them will take a hit, but then their single-minded focus in one product takes them through. They just don't look here and there. Colgate will do nothing except dental products. Hindustan Lever cannot be tempted into doing something else. Small experiment they will launch in Vizag or Kakinada, fail and come back, right? So single-minded focus, ability to attract talent and keep talent, and it's a growing market. If you say that there is demand for housing and there is demand for housing finance, fairly there will be demand for toothpaste and toothbrush and things like that. Funny, but 70 years later, we still need an MNC. Our banks are MNC, our mutual funds are MNC, our insurance is MNC, our toothpaste is MNC, our shampoo is MNC, our soap is MNC. We are MNC dependent. We are banks, everywhere we are. Our cars are made by MNC. We are MNC dependent. Why are we denying that? Where is the Indian entrepreneur? I can't see him.
Okay, so that was good. I think we have spoken a lot about MNCs in this episode. In the coming episode, let's talk about the Indian entrepreneurs. And we'll talk more about the small to big stories. And let's talk about a lot of other things. Thank you, and let's continue this conversation.
Thank you.